Let us pray. Gracious God, we give thanks for the military men and women, both past and present, and for the courageous service and sacrifice to our country and its people to secure the blessings of life, liberty, and justice for all. May our remembrance be a timely reminder that our freedom was purchased at a high cost and should not be taken for granted. Give us resolve to labor in faithful service to you until all share the benefits of freedom, justice, and peace through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Good morning. I am Cava's husband, Steve Sitnick, but for today's purposes, I'm going to be the MC of the first portion of today's presentation. So if we were to greet each other today, we would have two tasks. One is to say Happy Veterans Day, but the other one is to say Happy Armistice Day, for today is the centennial of the remembrance of what happened on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918, and that was the end of World War I. As a matter of fact, if you go to Kansas City tonight, you will see the World War I memorial lit up in a illumination of red poppies. So a very special day indeed. The purpose of the, well, it's bifurcated today. We have the panel, the veterans panel, and then afterwards our own Andy Pouncey, an expert on World War I, is going to give you a great presentation on the memorial and remembrance of the centennial of the Armistice Day. The purpose of the panel is to find faith, or finding faith in military service. So, before I begin by introducing the panel members, what I would first like to do is to ask all spouses of veterans to please stand. Thank you. Now, can I have all veterans or serving military members please stand? Now, can I have all children, grandchildren, nephews, and nieces of veterans please stand? All right, thank you. So why did I do that? Not only to thank you all for your support, but I think it's an illustrative exercise in the faithful community that we enjoy as veterans, and those who serve and contributed to it even today. And this is very much going to be, hopefully, an exercise in faithful community today. I'm delighted to introduce the panelists. All of them are very special people in my life. All the way over to your left is John Snyder, a very close personal friend, who not only contributed to our country as a United States Army Corps of Engineer officer, but also, as you all well know, contributes to community, not only professionally, but also in his role as the president of the soccer league, and has, through his personal efforts, contributed to the development of many future leaders and young folks in the community. Thank you, John. We're proud to have you here. The sage of the group is in the center. What wisdom has come out of this man's mouth? My personal friend, Frank Navarra, you all know him well. Frank is unique on the panel because he is the only one that was both an enlisted non-commissioned, or actually a enlisted non-commissioned officer and a commissioned officer, and served in both the active and the reserve. So please welcome Major Retired Frank Navarro. The other man on the panel today is a blessing to me. You know, when you live long enough to see that one of the most admired people, most admired men in your life is your own son, then wow. And I know many of you that I look upon can also say the same thing. But I would like to present to you Captain Mac Sitnick, United States Army Infantry. He commands a company in the 101st, right up the road in Clarksville, Tennessee, my son. On your seats in front of you, you will see some bios. I put those out there, and Jane, thank you so much for all your help in putting this together, just to kind of give you appreciation of the background of our panelists. Also, please take the time. You saw the folks who stood up today who were veterans, and thank them for the service. The panelists have all been given some questions, and actually, I guess I gave you some homework too as well to read. And so we thought what we'd do is we'd ask them to answer their questions, get their perspective on some of the questions, and then we're going to open it up for you all to answer questions. And then, of course, Andy's going to have some time to illuminate, I'll use that term, on the Armistice Day. Okay, so the first question is I asked the panelists to please reflect on and describe how their military service experience has enriched their Christian faith and made you perhaps even more attentive and responsive to ministering to others around you. So, Frank, how about if I let you start off, sir?
Well, first of all, it's an honor and privilege to be here in front of this group today, especially on this stage with these gentlemen who have been really warriors in our defense of our country, and I'm very honored and humbled to be part of this group. I was unique. I was a reservist, had some active duty. I was trained as a combat engineer, as enlisted. Came off of active duty in 1967, and my unit, reserve unit, was disbanded, and I was assigned to a field hospital as a medic. And my first real test of faith, I guess, was at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. I was assigned to a ward, orthopedic ward, 22 beds. We had a lot of wounded from Vietnam in there. And I walked in and I said, I can't do this. I don't know how to take care of these sick people. Nobody ever calls a medic when they feel good. They always call them when there's in trouble. And so after about 10 minutes of deliberating, I decided it's up to me to take a step forward to try to help these folks. And so my faith kicked in, and I thought, I've got to go in here and try to help relieve some of the pain and suffering that's going on with these guys. And that was really the first move in my faith journey as a military. It meant, thank you. Can you hear all right? It meant a lot to me to be able to participate in some of the treatment and carings that was given to these folks. And from that point forward, I took the role of a healer. And I know that Dr. Sitnick sees the same thing every day. And it was part of my experience, faith experience, to be able to provide service and health to these folks. It carried forward for the about 25 years in the military. I ended up being a commander of a field hospital as headquarters commander, and had sent troops off to harm's way when we had Desert Storm. But I retired in 1991, and I think I put in my bio, when your boots are older than half the people in the unit, it's time to hang them up. So that was my faith experience.
John, can you share with us something about faith in your military service?
Yes, I can.
Would you please, sir?
You've just learned the difference between an infantry officer and an engineer officer.
I stand corrected.
I'm going to answer that question a little differently. I just found out Frank was in a unit that was disbanded that I trained when I was on active duty. Did not know I trained disbanded units, but they didn't tell me that. Also was not aware that medics didn't have any training. Now I know that. It's been a good day for me. You know, when you just show up sometimes, you learn things. And I think that's been a lesson that I've learned in the military. When I was at West Point, and for those of you who have been on the vestry with me, you know that I like to play poker, and I usually took the rector's money. One day at West Point, I was playing poker, and I took money from a large sum of money from a roommate of mine. The next day, we had mandatory chapel formations, and I went to chapel. He went back to his room. He got in trouble. He then filed a federal lawsuit for mandatory chapel at West Point and won. That destroyed the moral character of West Point at that time, and I lived through that. I just wondered what would happen if I had not won that poker game. When I was at West Point, I also got in trouble. Some of you have heard about that, and I spent a lot of time in my senior year alone in my room walking on the area. Mac knows what that is. His dad was a colonel. He never got in trouble. At that time, I was lonely. I had senior year. It's a lot different now. When I was there, this is the Vietnam War era, and a lot of guys escaped. You took off your uniform. You escaped into the community, and you didn't want to be there. Well, I got stuck at West Point, and they took church away from me, mandatory church. That didn't feel very well. But I was alone in my room, and guys that I played basketball with, 2 years younger than I was, said, let's go to church. And if you've ever been to West Point, going to church is not walking in a straight line. You have to walk up a small hill. It's about 250 feet elevation. So it takes time to get to church at West Point. And I ended up doing that because that was my freedom. I got to go do that. I got to go to the mess hall and eat afterwards. Sunday was my free day, and I spent it with God. Has anyone ever had something taken away from you that's really important? That happened to me in my service, and I found it by walking up that hill. The other thing I did was when I got in active duty when I graduated from West Point, 3 days after I graduated, my brother got married. I was best man, and 4 days after I got married, my parents told me they were divorcing. I was alone again. Luckily, when I went on active duty, I packed everything up in the car that I had. I'd left nothing behind in my home, and I went out on my own, alone. A good friend of mine, now my best friend, introduced me to my wife. It was a blind date, and you can ask her how much fun that was. I'll pay for that later. But she introduced me to the Episcopal Church, and we went back on the Eastern Shore of Maryland when we went on weekends or on holidays. She had a great family life, and it was centered around church. That's where I got introduced to the Episcopal Church. I like the rigor. I like the structure of it. Most of all, I like being part of a family. And on active duty, at that time, we had a shortage of chaplains in the military, so we did not have a battalion chaplain. Did you have a battalion chaplain? Everybody was a chaplain when I was on active duty. So we went to a small church in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and I met some members of the community. I introduced some guys there. They got me involved in coaching basketball, their youth. That was fun. But then I went, at age 24, I was doing what Mac's doing. I was a company commander as a first lieutenant, and that didn't happen very often at Fort Bragg. They still call you the old man? Okay, back in my time, I was the old man at 24. And the problems that these guys brought to you, there is no class that they teach in the Army at that time on how to deal with personal problems and faith problems of your soldiers that were 10, 20, 30 years older than you were. You learned the hard way. It's called on-the-job training. And you had to go back to your basics that you came up to. Luckily for my parents, I went to Sunday school, did all that stuff. So the youth program here at Holy Communion is important because you don't know the value of it for 20 years later. So you got to support that youth program because you don't know where it's going to provide benefits. Sandy, that's $20, by the way. Heard that before. But the military provides you all sorts of interesting things. I got deployed one time. I told you don't give me the microphone. But I was deployed down in Guatemala, and they had an earthquake, and they didn't train me how to deal with live bodies you found in mountainous areas that were crushed in a car on how to deal with them. That tests your faith right there. How do you bury people? How do you deal with them? And you don't learn that except you get on your knees and you ask for faith on how to take care of that. There's lots of incidents like that. When you've had, if you've ever seen movies on people that die, how do you write a letter to their parents explaining their bravery and their sacrifice? There was no class to teach us how to do that. That was tough to do. And again, it goes back to the stuff you do day in and day out, week in and week out, on Sunday mornings, on Wednesday nights, on everything you do. It's all cumulative. So everything you do today will have benefit. I'll also tell you that I went to church because I needed to go. I didn't know why I wanted to go, but it was an escape for me. Have you ever felt that you didn't want to be there, but you wanted to go anyway? Usually that's when you got the most benefit out of it. So when you don't feel good about doing something, go do it. Sandy may even have a nice word that may affect your life.
All right. Thank you very much. Mac, the task is tell us how you have found faith in your military service.
Good morning, everyone. This is Mr. Snyder, as you're talking about, I can relate to the story about going up to church. When you first get to West Point, they do services every week, and it's a flurry of like a change of lifestyle, a lot of stress, and I was having a great time. But the first service we went, you sit out and you look at the Hudson River, and I remember we were singing a hymn, and we cut off, and they break off into different denominations. And one of the most poignant memories is that I knew as I was saying, as we were saying the creed and we were singing these hymns, I knew that hundreds of miles away, my mom and dad were doing the same thing. So that connection that we have through our faith, specifically in the physical aspect of the denomination, is pretty cool. But with faith in service, so I joined the Army to help people, and so it was a very general kind of goal or mission, but it's kind of kept me centered on how we go about leading or how we take certain jobs. So the Army has moments of the stuff you would see on a poster where you're actually out there in the mud, challenging guys, pushing them forward. And then there's those other moments where you're sitting in a room on a computer, working PowerPoint, away from your wife, and she has no idea why you're doing that. But with the goal of doing a good job to know that you stand in the gap at that point, and your efforts will make a difference, and why and how hard you push makes a difference. So. But there are other moments of great desperation. So when I was in Ranger School or something else where the Army, through challenging training, kind of takes everything else away from you in order to make you stronger. It's in those moments where I found confirmation of God's faith and, or the God's glory and being able to reach out and help. I was able to succeed at some things where didn't make any sense. We emerged out of Ranger School in the winter where it was so cold and your body was so weak, like your skin just started cracking, and then you realized, and you had I got out, and had multitude of ailments, but you were able to get through it because at that point in time, God was going to take care of you. My first duty station was at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. I was privileged to lead paratroopers. It's an awesome lifestyle. The guys there are very motivated. The method that you get to the battlefield is you jump out of an airplane. And the most effective way to do that is not, it's different from if you're skydiving, a very scenic, controlled, high up descent. You make some pretty cool Instagram posts, but effective way to get a paratrooper there is you jump at a very low altitude. And so part of it was just the physics of it, but mostly my faith. People in the Army and outside will be like, weren't you, is that scary to jump out? I'm like, well, no. Either stuff's going to work as it should or you're going to die. So it's there's no real in between. Yeah, exactly. So, when you have the faith in Christ, you have that certainty that regardless of what happens, you're going to be okay. So you don't have time or the energy to expend on worry. But I think the moments I found faith, I've been challenged a lot more. So I think everyone in their job everyone has deadlines, everyone has time spent away. The Army is great, continuing to we make deadlines for ourselves that don't need to be there. But we challenge ourselves so that if and when we get called up to do something, that we're strong enough to be able to go forth and do that, so everyone else isn't involved, or we don't involve unnecessary people into a fight that we're tasked to do. So in those moments where it's been pretty challenging or you experience defeat, personally, sometimes you just I've had to come back and say, reflect on, the only thing that's getting me through this is I know that there's a bigger picture. God has something, what God's leading us to is bigger than the task at hand. And then when soldiers run up against these challenges, as Mr. Schneider alluded to, the men and women who serve in our Army, we've had a lot of amazing experiences, but I've been most impressed with the 19-year-old kids, with the 18-year-old wife, with 2 kids of their own, and they're sitting, spending the long hours. So it's the work that we do that is the real service of kind of taking care of them. And so there were a couple of moments in my life where guys have come up to me and I've had to stand in the gap and not only be minister to them in the sense of explaining why we're doing something, but kind of take off my rank, take off literally and figuratively, and be that shoulder and say, you know what, as your commander, I can give you this direction, but as Max Sitnick, let me just pray with you right now. And so whether they have that faith inclination or whether that's a shock to them, sometimes that's what they need too. So God's in the midst of the hardest times and God's in the midst of the easiest times. But remembering and seeing him through all that has been a comfort.
This actually feels like a good time to open it up. If you all have any questions you would like to ask of the panelists, whether it's specifically about their faith experience in the military or anything else related to it, please feel free. Anybody have a question?
This goes to either one of the three of y'all. You were talking about your faith experience in the service and had you had to go up the hill to the chapel and all. I was wondering, when you were in the service, like in the field, I'm going to assume there were chaplains. Do any of y'all have stories in your conversations or experiences or whatever with the, shall we say, the religious side of the being in the service?
I didn't realize I was going to get my PT today.
Yes, we did have chaplains in the field. I'll tell you kind of a funny story. When I was in basic, on Sundays we were offered the opportunity to go to chapel for 1 hour, or you could stay in the barracks and clean the floors. So we had a lot of conversions during that time frame. This was at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, and it was summertime and it was hot. The chapel had no air conditioning, it had a little fan going, and this priest was giving a sermon one day, and he was of very heavily virtue, but not much earthly good. And he kind of got on the front row, went to sleep, and started snoring. And halfway through the sermon, the priest leaned over and says, I want everybody to pay attention to what I'm about to say. If you want to go to heaven, keep your seat. But if you want to go to hell, he slammed his fist down and says, stand up. Well, this soldier snapped to attention. And everybody started laughing. And the priest said, what do you have to say for yourself, young man? He said, well, I don't know what's so funny, but you and I are the only two standing here, Padre.
You asked if I had an experience with a chaplain. Some of the places I went, they wouldn't even go. So there was not a plethora of chaplains available in the military. Looking back on that, when you don't have that resource, you have to become that resource. And as I'll pick on the ministers here, you have 3 things you can do that we can't do. Is that right? I did listen. Good. So the rest of us have to pick up the pace. And if they're not there, obviously we didn't have communion, we didn't baptize, and we didn't, I forget the other 3. We didn't do those things when the chaplains weren't there. But we got to do all the other stuff. And at the time that happened, when Mac said somebody needs to pray, you pray. And no one, back when I was in, and I'm sure you have some challenges now, is they don't care what your religion is, what denomination you come for. They just want to have a meeting between them and God. And as an officer and a leader, that's what you're supposed to do. I think you're trained to be sensitive to that, but when you don't have the resources as in an officer position, what you're asked to do, they don't want to hear that you don't have that resource. You find a way to get it done.
Yes, so we have experiences with chaplains too. So the most effective chaplains I've seen. So I'm an infantry officer. So we're the grunts. I joined the infantry because I wanted to be there in the mud with the guys and be able to look over when they're like, man, this stinks, and then just have a smile on my face and be like, this is awesome. And really challenge them. And so the most effective chaplains that we've had in our infantry units have been those who have been with the guys, whether served as infantrymen in the past or they don't just hide away in their offices. Like, they get out and they do the hard training, whether it's physical activity or they go to the field where it's raining for days on end. And I think we can kind of expand that. Like, I mean, that's what Jesus did. He didn't just sit back and say, like, we should do nice things, and then he was down there ministering to people who were sick, and people noticed. And so I think that kind of mirrors why the most effective chaplains I've seen have done that as well.
Well, I think I think this is probably a good. Go ahead.
I have a somewhat unusual reply to the last question. I'm Jewish. My brother was a major in the reserves in a medical support unit when he was called up to serve in the first Kuwait War. They showed up at he was called up to report at Fort McCoy, Wisconsin, and they got this huge auditorium full of people and said, all the Jews fall out over there. And the man stood up in front of them and said, we don't expect anyone to be captured in this war, but if anyone does get captured, be aware that it shows your religion on your dog tags. We are passing out change of religion forms now. You have 20 minutes to decide what to do. People differed in what they decided to do, but whatever their decision, they knew full well that they were going to get complete support both from God and from all the chaplains.
That's terrific. Well, this is a good time to prepare to transition to the second portion of our program, but please know that this has been a special period of worship and community that we've been able to share with you. And I just couldn't be any more proud of my faith community for so many reasons. You encourage us, you equip us, you enable us with God's holy grace as His ambassadors and His witnesses. Thank you on behalf of all the veterans for what you all do for us. And if I could just have a very brief closing prayer to remember those who serve right now. Let us pray. Lord, hold our troops in your loving hands. Protect them as they protect us. Bless them and their families for the selfless acts they perform for us in our time of need. Amen. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I'm Andy Pouncey. I'm not a veteran, but I have a strong interest in War I, and I was appointed to the Tennessee Great War Commission. What I wanted to talk about a little bit first was religion, actually post-war, in that church was not enough for some veterans. And so many of them turned to spiritualism. And if you know the author, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote Sherlock Holmes, he began a series of seances. He had lost his brother-in-law in the Battle of the Mons in 1914. So both he and his wife carried on seances across the world, actually. So for some, it's just religion was not enough. What you found was that here our boys had fought thousands of miles away, and many did not come home. And so those that didn't come home, the families had choice. You could leave your loved one there in France in the fields, or you could choose to bring them home. And there were many that they never found, because when war upon war upon war battles, the soil gets turned up and many are not found. So what I want to do today is show you how people remember, how I remember, how groups remember, okay? Can we get the big screen on that? Okay, that's good enough? Okay. All right. I recently made my 7th trip to the Western Front. Many people often ask me, well, have you been to Bastogne or Normandy? And I said, well, that was the children's war of they were the greatest generations, but War I was the parents of the greatest generation. So, in all, there were 10 million people who were killed in War I. It made great changes in medicine, mechanized warfare, gas. 4 empires were destroyed, from Germany to Russia to Austria and the Ottoman Empire. And the British were never the same afterwards. So of those 10 million, 100,000 approximately were U.S. And half of those were soldiers killed on battle, but the other half died of influenza. Interestingly, influenza didn't affect the young and the old. It was the strong. It was the soldier who could fight that virus back. That meant the virus just fought back harder. So they were the ones that suffered. My grandfather began at Camp Grant out of Chicago, and he caught influenza on the ship across, because when you had that many people coming together, whether it was on trains or ships, that virus spread. And so he ended up in a hospital in Liverpool but never fought. So also, you've heard about Gold Star mothers, Gold Star families. These are people who lost a loved one. And this began at the First World War as well. President Wilson did not want to see black armbands on people, so they came up with the idea of the Gold Star. And so the Gold Star mothers were finally granted 10 years after the war the privilege of going back and seeing where their loved one was buried. So that's how the Gold Star mothers came to be. And what they did was, the Gold Star mothers trained in New York, then they shipped over to Paris, and they were taken out to the battlefields, and they were given a wreath and some cards and things to visit with their loved one, and then the trip, came back and returned. So I do want to say that there's still a lot left over there, is that every year they have the Iron Harvest. And what the Iron Harvest is that imagine being a farmer in France, but you have to have a metal plate underneath your tractor, just like they do with the IEDs and such, because you don't know what you're going to hit. In 2016 in the Somme, there were 54 tons of ordnance raised up in the ground. And so that when we go and walk these battlefields, we went through some what they call red zones, which have so much ordnance in them today still that you can't grow anything, you can't do anything. You don't want to plant anything in soil that has this. And so fortunately I had good leaders to take us through some of those areas, but the ordnance is all around you, from trench stakes to shells and so forth. So what I like to do is this ready to roll? Let's see. I don't know how. Well, I just want to advance it myself. Okay. All right, well, what you saw first was, back September 26, there were a group of us who went to the Meuse-Argonne Cemetery. Now, most of the action in France with the U.S. was the Saint-Mihiel sector and the Meuse-Argonne sector. This is about 200 miles east of Paris. And so they made it their point to put luminaries on 14,246 graves. So I signed up for that, and there was about 200 of us that put those candles on there. I always wondered if it was going to be a battery-operated or a real candle. It was a real candle. And so this is my friend Uzziah, and his brother is Ezekiel, but his sister's named Gigi. He was born in the United States. His parents live in France, and he's gone to French schools ever since he was 6. He's 13. He's a Boy Scout, and the Boy Scouts put the flags on the graves. So there you have the young involved in this. Well, what we did was we traveled from grave to grave for about 200 of them, and we list the man's name or the lady's name, and then we'd say the regiment, and then where they were from, and then we'd move to another one. But he was so polite. I would hand him that candle, and he'd always say thank you. It was very refreshing to see that. So, events. Also at the Meuse-Argonne Cemetery, this shows you too how much, money, time, and effort has been put to remember those veterans. Initially, there were 2,400 temporary cemeteries in France. They then consolidated them into 8 major cemeteries, and this one is Meuse-Argonne Cemetery. But in there, you see the division, the different divisions are put into stained glass in the windows. Okay. All right. Here you see the flags of the French and the Americans. They're together, and I don't care what people say about France. They appreciate us. Okay. This is the San Miguel American Cemetery. Now, these cemeteries are cared for by the American Battle Monuments Commission. They are centered in Washington, but they also have posts out over in Paris. This is a marker that a parent had built for his son. And Pershing says, no, not on his grave. We'll put it on the side because every soldier should be the same. These are some members of the American Battle Monuments Commission that came together for this occasion. And then you always have your reenactors as well. Okay. My first time in 2007 when I went to a Memorial Day service, I love it. You got the bands, you got the fire brigades, you got everybody. And after the service is over, we all march about two miles into Romagna. And we go to City Hall, and everybody drinks champagne. We ought to try that over here, you know? So. Okay. And we have our Pershing reenactor here. Okay. Okay. Now, this is the Montfaucon Memorial. It's like every army wants to take the hill, okay? So this is Montfaucon, and this was the beginning of the action for the First Army in the Meuse-Argonne sector. And this is about 200-something feet tall. I did it once, and that was enough. So, and then they recently dedicated the Lafayette Escudero Memorial. This is out of Suresnes in Paris. And in the crypt, on the next picture, you see where the pilots were buried. This is a group of pilots who thought it important to go over before America was ever involved. America was involved from April 6th, 1917, and then, of course, the war ended November 11th. So it was very short, comparatively, to other wars. This is Mont Sec in the San Miguel sector. Actually, this monument was bombed in War II because the Germans were trying to take the hill, and we wanted to get them off the hill. We bombed our own memorial. We had to rebuild it. This is Suresnes. This is out of Paris. It sits above Paris. You can see the Eiffel Tower and all from there. And while I was there, the superintendent said, I want to show you some graves. And this speaks to the fact that you've heard the term shell shock, and today you hear, what's the term now, John? Help me with it. PTSD. Okay. There are two ladies buried here, Dorothy and Gladys Cromwell. They were from the Northeast. And they came from very rich families, had everything they ever wanted. They went across as civilian nurses, and they saw the worst of the worst. But after the war, on the ship on the way back, they decompressed. They decided to join hands and jump overboard. They couldn't take going back to the great life. So they're buried there. But each cemetery is so well maintained. There was a cross that was one side of the ground, and I asked the man, I said, why is this one laying down? He said, you see this ledge on top? He says, it shouldn't be there. It needs to be smooth. It needs to be perfect. Now, another thing is that if you go over there to seek out your relative, you can use two things. One is you can use IGN maps, which is about a 25,000 scale, and you can use World War I battle maps and overlay them and get your compass out. And so you can find these places, but then you have the Phillips collection of photos. And there were 5 photographers sent out after the war was over. They were told to take everything you can. And they also have coordinates on them, you know, latitude and longitude. So actually, on our tour, our leader would take us out to certain points, and he would show up with this photo and say, and then look beyond, and you saw the same thing. And then on the right, you see one of the temporary cemeteries. and what it looks like today. Okay. There are also many streets named. This is in Cantonese, after the U.S. And we have a lot of memorials and statues all around. Now, this was a personal one to me. I come by materials from different people. And this is a lady from Memphis. She's Edna. So what the hunt is always important to me. And so I found out from the American Battle Monuments Commission where her hospital 57 was in Paris. So I went there, and I was sitting across the street from her, and I go, I got to go in. But my French is about this much, on peu, as they say. And so what I did was I had posted all this on Facebook. I don't know if you follow me, but I journaled all day on Facebook because one is that if I don't show up, you know where I was last. And two, it helps my memory. I may not remember it from morning till night. Anyway, I had her photographs from 1918 on the left, and I went and took pictures of the place today on the right. So I went in there, and it was the school today, and it was, security and all this, and I looked at her, and she looked at me, and we knew we didn't speak the same language. So I opened up my Facebook, and I went, Nurse Américaine. And so I rolled it, and I said, Votre école, meaning your school. Then I went, Aujourd'hui, meaning today. And I did that again for some other pictures. And all of a sudden, the smile came on her face, and that was my entry. And so they took me in. I learned everything about what Edna did in her hospital. So let's go. All right, now, we got two people here in the audience who have relatives from World War I. Peggy, who's that? That's Jack's father right there. And we have one more. And that's Barbara Wilson's father, okay? He was... Well, let's see what Barbara's grandfather looks like. Handsome fella, isn't he? He was about 50, but he was a medical doctor, okay? So anyway, I think what I tried to show you today was that people still remember, individually or in groups. We thank all the veterans. Thank you.
Can we just have one more round of applause for our panelists, for our Master of Ceremonies, and for our speaker? We hatch ideas for things like this in the parish office, never quite sure whether they're going to fly or not, and this one has just flown beyond all expectations, so thank you all so much. At the 10:30 service, I hope everyone will stay. The choir is going to be offering the Fare Requiem, which is something we've taken to doing on the Sunday after All Saints, to continue our remembrance of those who've gone before. It's the blessed coincidence of the 100th anniversary of the armistice falling on this day, so please do stay for that important offering. And continue to remember and give thanks for all those who've sacrificed for our freedoms in the United States and abroad. Thank you all very, very much.